Hello, welcome to Webinar Wednesday. My name is Martin Loffers. I'm the Chief Trend Watcher of Supply Chain Media. You might also know me as the Editor-in-Chief of Supply Chain Movement. That's a European quarterly magazine and also bi-weekly newsletter and a huge group rapidly growing on LinkedIn. And I will be moderating this live webinar this coming hour, and we're going to talk about how to kickstart sustainable procurement and supply chain sustainability, a very important topic. And with me, I have an expert, and you see me on the left. That's me, all right. And to the right, you see Thomas Boeg Andersen. He's co-founder and CEO of Responsibly. Hi, Thomas.
Hi, Martin. Great to be here.
So a few things. So this webinar will be recorded, and the PDF will be made available within 48 hours. So that's something good to know. The audience is on mute, but we want to make it as interactive as possible. So feel free as a participant to ask questions. And you see two ways to ask questions. You have the chat functionality. You see it on the upper right side. You see some clouds as a chat, and next to that on the right you see a Q&A, and please ask questions in the Q&A functionality. I will track down. So if these questions are about the topic Thomas and myself are discussing, I will ask it immediately. If not, you can also have this Q&A opportunity at the end. So there's a lot of opportunity to ask questions. So and if you still have some questions after 5 o'clock CET, we have another 30 minutes where Thomas and I will be sitting down in the lounge. We'll be sitting at table 1, so you can have a direct conversation with Thomas and me about the topic we have discussed. So that's it for the practicality. And now we go into sustainable sourcing and supply chain. So what Supply Chain Media has done, we have analyzed over 250 supply chain startups and scale-ups in Europe, 250, so a lot of them. We know a lot of founders of these startups and scale-ups, and you see it right here. This is the overview of Q2, and you can download it. I will share the link later. And as you can see, there are 10 categories. Moving from left to right is on the supplier side, up to visibility, and all the way to the right, you have last mile delivery. And you see a lot of startups and scale ups from all over Europe, and that's basically what we have done. And you see marked down in red on the left hand side, that's Responsibly. Still a startup in our opinion, but that might change very rapidly. But Thomas will comment on that later. And basically, what we have done with all these startups, we have analyzed it for a purpose, and the purpose is, we created an European supply chain startup contest, as in 2018 for the first time. And last May we did the 5th edition, and we had 3 finalists in the European supply chain startup contest. That was a part of our Innovate Supply Chain event in the Netherlands, and we had 3 finalists: Jarvis, C-Trace, and Responsibly. And the reason why I'm talking to Thomas right now is, Responsibly has won, so they are the winner of our 5th European supply chain startup contest. So Thomas, that's you on the right,
That
and
is
your
me.
and your colleague on the left. So what was your response of winning this contest?
So I think, the reasons that these events matters a lot to us is that we want to work in collaboration with the industry to try to empower sustainable procurement. So it's always great to be recognized by the industry and talk to people who are sitting in supply chain and procurement day to day and trying to implement some of the things that we're working on as well. So we always love being engaged in events like that.
Yeah. So the jury, I was part of the jury, was constituted of people from business, supply chain people, but also investors, and also a previous winner of a European startup contest. It was Emilia from Windel. So we have a diverse jury in the contest, and 50% of the votes was based on the public voting of the audience on site, 250 people, and I think 400 people were online. So we had a mix, and based on that, we came to the conclusion that Responsibly is the winner of our European supply chain startup contest. But Thomas, could you first introduce yourself a bit? Tell me a bit more about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we're a fairly recent company. We founded in 2021 out of a central belief that procurement and supply chain function is driving a lot of the impact we see around the world. So we wanted to help companies making it a lot easier to make every purchase in the world responsible. And we then started working on what we call a data platform to very easily and scalably assess how sustainable your suppliers are, but also to drive actions to improve that sustainability. Now we're 14 people. We're working with more than 20 different companies across a few different industries. We work a lot with direct procurement, but also a little bit with indirect spend as well. We've won a few different awards. This one, semi-finalists in DBW. We were interviewed by Google, etc. We've raised some venture capital and so on. So we're on a good track right now. And me personally, I've been in supply chain for a while. I founded another supply chain scale-up before called Offload, working very much in the logistics space to try to make that more sustainable. And that's still running in Australia. And then I spent quite a lot of years in BCG doing consulting. So you'll probably sense that a little bit today that I'm still a little bit biased of my early consulting days.
Oh, that's not bad. But you have a practical approach also in the scale-up area. That's a good point. All right, let's have a first look at the agenda, and we'll go through it. So these are the three topics we're going to address in the next 50 minutes or so. So what's happening, what is the approach to take action, and how to measure and to follow up on. So first, maybe you can elaborate a bit more what's happening in your world and in supply chain for that matter.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, one of the interesting things about supply chain sustainability is that it's been moving through a journey, right? We started with corporate social responsibility and triple bottom line a lot of years ago, but that was mainly about compliance and basically checking all the boxes and not really getting very deep with our suppliers. To now having this big sustainability movement where consumers, B2B customers, investors, and a lot of different stakeholders are asking corporate. And when you start at a company's sustainability footprint, 60 to 80% of that footprint simply sits in the supply chain. So it's all about supply chain sustainability if you want to be sustainable, right? And that's why supply chain sustainability is absolutely exploding right now. Due to that factor, you now see regulations stepping in as well. So we saw last year the German Supply Chain Act getting announced, which is very exciting.
Yeah. Could you repeat it? So we're missing some connection.
We're seeing the US experimenting with mandating sustainability due diligence in your supply chain. Sorry, Martin?
Yeah, no. I missed one part of the sentence. So yeah.
Okay, all good. Yeah, and then the last point is that as companies strive towards sustainability, they want to get accredited towards it, right? So a lot of the different certificates we're seeing or different accreditors are now moving towards putting supply chain in the focus as well. So, for example, you're not going to be able to disclose to CDP anymore or get a B Corporation certificate without having an approach to supply chain sustainability. So we're seeing this whole movement taking off right now, and a lot of activity being driven when it comes to supply chain sustainability, which is super exciting to see.
Yeah. And in the first part, 60 to 80% of the footprint is in your supply chain or outside your company. We're getting into the area of scope 3. Scope 1 and 2 is within your company, and scope 3 is outside your company on the supplier side or on the buyer side, the downstream side, and that's driving a lot of the attention to supply chain sustainability on one hand. But getting back on your final part about ESG branding and other stuff, there's a lot of acronyms in this field and a lot of buzzwords. So maybe we have to address that first because that's important because we see a lot of acronyms and a lot of buzzwords.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a funny contour here, right? We need some new jargon because the public are starting to understand what we're talking about. And that's what it feels a little bit when we talk about sustainability, because there's so many buzzwords, right? What does sustainability mean? What does CSR mean? ESG, sustainability goals, SDGs, etc.
Yeah.
And that can be a little bit overwhelming because sustainability in itself doesn't mean anything, right? So we need to break it down. And we've brought some slides with it on that as well, but we need to start talking about the concrete parameters behind sustainability and understand what is it that we're actually assessing, and stop talking about this big black box of sustainability, because it leaves us a bit overwhelmed and makes it very hard to actually take action on it.
Yeah, and if you look at the UN goals, there are 17 UN goals, and the UN is recommending pick a few that is applicable to you. But the flip side of this is that companies who are in Western Europe will pick the ones that are the easiest for them, and not the hardest when you talk about upstream child labor, that kind of stuff. It's very hard to address as a manufacturer in Europe, if you are in fashion, whatever. So that's one thing. My take on these UN goals, and the other thing is these 17 UN goals are related, so they are not separate. It's whole system dynamics. That's the broadest sense. And now we get to the smaller sense. We talk about decarbonization of the supply chain. That's the other end of the spectrum, I would say.
Exactly. So, I'm an ex-consultant, so I like structure a lot. So when we started Responsibly, we started breaking sustainability into its component parts, because one of the things is that, as you appropriately say, the definition of sustainability is a little bit of a moving target. Depending on what industry you're in, what region you're in, you'll have different material risk, and that definition of sustainability moves. So we shouldn't be evaluating everything for everyone, for example. So it's more than just CO2 emissions. When we broke it down, we really kind of broke it into a little bit inspired by the ESG framework, but there's a bunch of environmental parameters related to, let's say, biodiversity or soil health or air pollution or water stewardship, etc. Then we've deliberately separated out a lot of the emissions parameters around your different scopes of emissions, whether you've set targets to reduce, whether you are managing to actually make reductions on those targets, etc. Then you have kind of a big bucket under the different social aspects. The most common ones and also commonly regulated are going to be the ones around child labor, forced labor, but it also related to the workplace conditions, the health and safety, whether or not the employees have freedom of associations. And then there's the whole diversity topic as well, right? So, especially, moving in the UK, how can we make sure that our suppliers are, empower smaller suppliers with a diversity agenda as well? So there's quite a lot of different topics here. And then at last we have the sub-tier, which is basically just saying, one thing is assessing how sustainable, socially, environmental one company is today, but just like you're looking at your supply chain, we also need to look at their supply chain. So to which extent are they evaluating the supply chain for human rights, for environment, for diversity? Do we actually know where the different materials comes from, etc.? So it's a little bit of a broad landscape, and that can be quite overwhelming, which is why it's important that we need to understand, what are the actual, risks associated with an individual company, and what should we be evaluating? Because it doesn't make sense to evaluate all of these 74 parameters for every single company.
No. And as you mentioned before, there are some drivers, especially from a governmental perspective, accelerating this need for sustainability in supply chain.
That's exactly right. So we talked a little bit about the German Supply Chain Act and the EU directive earlier. When we look at it from a regulatory point of view, we typically see a broad perspective being pushed rather than a singular focus. So the German Supply Chain Act is very focused on social parameters, all the environmental parameters that are related to how we experience the world as human beings. So that could be, for example, land and water pollution, right? That's very related to what we experience as human beings as well. So we've mapped it to a certain number of parameters and are then able to go in and individually track these parameters so you are compliant with the Act. If you look at the EU directive that was proposed in February this year, you see a little bit of a broader perspective. So a lot of the same social parameters they have on there, but they go a lot deeper in different environmental parameters as well, like water consumption or GHG emissions or threatened species and biodiversity and so on. We'll see what actually gets implemented, but we do see a clear pattern that regulation is taking the broader lens to sustainability.
And now, especially in the supply chain, we have a focus on decarbonization. We have our carbon footprint. So what is your take on that? How important is it to look at your carbon footprint?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things when you're then talking to stakeholders within companies is, and there's a guy called Jan Koniesko, and I'm probably pronouncing the name wrong here, but he works in I think one of the big data consulting houses, and he created this expression called carbon tunnel vision, that CO2 emissions is so much a topic these days that when it comes to sustainability, we tend to tunnel focus on just improving emissions and not doing anything about all of the other sustainability issues like poverty or water crisis, etc. So we do see a tendency when there's no regulation or anything else pushing it, that a lot of companies are biased towards doing something about decarbonization. This is also driven by them having set public commitments to reduce Scope 3 emissions, for example, by a certain year. And of course, that's then more urgent. They need to do something about it. And a lot of investors and buyers and so on are also pushing targets to be set and reductions to be made. But it could also be other priorities we see pushed internally. We see companies having objectives around living wages in the supply chain, making sure all of their suppliers are being paid a living wage. We see, as we talked about earlier, diversity objectives being launched, especially in the US and the UK, for certain material factors or certain industries where water stewardship and deforestation is a big criteria. We also see different initiatives being driven towards that, partly because the consumers will be expecting it. And that's why companies are then also driving it. But typically, it's a little bit more of a narrow focus to also, be pragmatic in implementing and not trying to implement everything at once.
I got a question from the audience. Thank you for this. I don't know if it's appropriate to ask it at this moment, but the question is, what about circular economy and circular supply chain? Is it also somewhere in here?
Yeah, it's a great question. And for us, again, we're very careful about the buzzwords because we think, circularity is just another buzzword like sustainability or CSR or ESG, right? So we need to boil it down to what it actually means. So when you look at the parameters behind circularity, it's a lot about recycling, upcycling, etc. And those parameters we're able to go in and track. It's very important as well. And the data typically sits on the product level, right? So it's not necessarily that a company itself is circular. You can measure a little bit the amount of waste they're producing, etc. But it's also very interesting to see the individual products you're buying. What's the circularity behind the materials going into it? Have the materials, are they being recycled? And is there a recycling program for the product afterwards? Is it easy to repair? Like the Nespresso capsules you're buying, that there might be a lot of different issues with, but one of the things they have been able to implement is a very good recycling program.
Yeah.
So circularity is definitely part of the picture as well, but I think what's important is that we go into the individual parameters like recycling, and that we can then evaluate those individually so we get away from the buzzwords.
Yeah, and I see that a lot of consultancy are pitching circularity and circular supply chain, especially from a business model perspective. But that's from the high end, strategic end, whereas we're going to discuss the practical operational part of all this. And maybe we're getting into the reality. Maybe you can address that to that matter. What is the reality? How should we approach it?
Yeah, so beyond internal stakeholders and regulation, another kind of great resource to drive that sustainable procurement strategy is to look at what's called the material risk factors behind the industries in the regions you're procuring from. So there's a lot of different frameworks out there, and unfortunately, there's not really a good catch-all framework that you can analyze all of your suppliers by. So you typically need to look into a few different analytics. But if you look at something like Sustainability Accounting Standards Board or some resources, Science-Based Target Network or Encore have produced, you can go in and see, for the individual industries that you're buying from the individual regions you're buying from, what are the risk factors? And that can help you really tailor that analysis because, for example, even though emissions are popular, not all of your suppliers come with a high emission risk factors. And it's not necessarily that you should force everybody to disclose emissions and set targets, but you need to focus on the individual parameters that are important to evaluate. And these different frameworks can help guide you to do that as well.
Okay, now we're getting more into the practical area. So maybe you can explain what is the best practice? What is the approach for a company?
Yeah, exactly. So the way that we see best practices, and of course, this is what we've been trying to implement in our tool as well, is really to, take that supplier master data that you're sitting on, specifically the industries and the regions that you're procuring from, and then first you do a little bit of a heat map analysis where you aggregate, the different recommendations. So what regulation are you affected by? Where do you need to seek compliance? What internal priorities do we have? It might be from a branding element or from a competitive perspective that you need to start pushing, certain sustainability definitions to be competitive in your industry. And then what are the material risks, both, from a risk perspective, but also from an impact perspective? If we really want to make an impact, what do we actually need to start optimizing for? And that then helps you with a little bit of a heat map analysis, help you understand, what are the different segments that I'm buying from, and what are the different topics that I need to be evaluated by those segments. And then based on that, you should set up your scorecards and your evaluation. So again, we don't really believe in one size fits all, and you should be evaluating everything everywhere. So we help our clients basically set up their own scorecards for different supplier segments where they can really approach the topics that are important to them and the specific supplier. So we only evaluate that, and we don't try to, evaluate everything.
So basically, on the right-hand side, you see the user interface of your platform of Responsibly.
Exactly. And, this is really the best practice we're recommending, even if you go by us or not, is to find out, how can we narrow down the topic. So we ask the context relevant data request and try to reduce the burden on the individual suppliers.
Right. Okay, let's go to the second part of this webinar. So what sustainable procurement looks like and how to take action. And maybe you can tell us a bit more. What is a starting point?
Exactly. So this is where the consultant in me gets out again. We have this expression in consulting that boiling the ocean, right? So I wanted to talk about action before we talk about data because when we start talking about data, we often hear this expression that we can't manage what we don't measure. And that's correct, but we also need to be careful that we're trying to measure everything because that makes it extremely unscalable. And as I mentioned in consulting, we have this expression when we end up overanalyzing that we're trying to boil the ocean. And you even have a visual there, right? If you try to put a lighter under the entire ocean, it's very hard to make it boil. So we need to really segment, the analysis we need to make based on the actions that we're going to take. So we make sure we use that data, and then we go for a very targeted collection exercise. So that's why I want to talk action a little bit before we start talking about data and how to measure it. We need to understand exactly what actions do we actually want to drive.
So maybe you can tell me a bit more about what kind of data do you need and what are you going to do with it?
Yeah, so again, data is the enabler, but data is not really, what's going to create progress in the world, right? So when we engage with our clients on sustainable procurement, we typically first talk about what goals do you want to set. So we see 4 kind of general goals our clients are setting. One is, a general increase in sustainability performance, and this is typically for purposes of, for example, being able to say that your products are sustainably procured, etc. But this is all about understanding what are the material risk factors related to the individual products or the individual supply chain, and then making sure we're optimizing for that. Another goal could be that you want to meet reporting requirements. So let's say that you're trying to get evaluated by EcoVadis or get certified by B Corporation or someone else where supply chain is in the focus. Then we need to make sure that any data collected can help you meet those reporting requirements, basically. Then there's the regulatory demands. We went through that, right? And how can we make sure that you're compliant with the different regulations that are affecting you? And then there's a reputational angle as well, of course, which isn't created equally across all of the parameters, because we see some of the biggest reputational risk happening, especially with the social issues like child labor or animal welfare, etc., where it's going to be a lot more likely that you're going to be exposed if you have suppliers that are not performing well on these parameters than, for example, that your suppliers are not disclosing emissions. So there's different targets, and we need to understand what do you want to optimize for, what do you want to optimize for today versus tomorrow, and then that's going to drive your activities. And there's really two major activities when it comes to sustainable procurement. One is with your existing supplier base. How can you collaborate with them to increase performance or mitigate risks? And we break it down a little bit into different activities on the right-hand side. The first step that everyone can really take is to start putting it on the scorecard and performance management talks and hold them accountable, right? So it might be very difficult to change some of your suppliers, but they should know that this is something that you care about. This is something that you are evaluating them by. And this should start forming part of those performance management discussions. And this can be done from the get-go, right? We see bigger companies starting to incentivize suppliers. So if you have a lot of bargaining power or a lot of flexibility in your spend, you can start tying performance improvements to better payment terms, for example, or even higher prices, right? But the first step is just putting it on the scorecard. Then there might be some areas where you need to get to a deeper data quality layer, right? And this is something that might even happening today, where you say, okay, this supplier is very high risk. We actually only have data that they have given to us and what's called self-assessed data. But due to the region that they're based in, we do need to get a physical audit done. So some of the places, especially when you're optimizing to lower your reputational risk, you might want to get to a deeper level of data quality. Sometimes you might find out that some parameters are not performing. You might have done an audit and find out that these parameters are underperforming. So you ask the supplier to start mitigate risk and get them to perform corrective action. And then sometimes you may even want to collaborate with the supplier, work directly with them to understand how we can remake the products or the materials you're buying to really reduce the footprint. So there's a lot of activities around collaboration. And then there's a lot of activities around spend allocation, right? So, again, first step here is really to put it on the scorecard when you're in sourcing decisions, Let's not talk about weights, but when you are comparing suppliers on price and quality, you should have sustainability in the picture as well, both to send the right signal to your suppliers, but also to understand whether, when prices and other factors are being roughly equal, is there a big delta on sustainability? Sometimes we also see sustainability performance being linked to lower cost structures because they're more efficient and a lot of your footprint comes from wasteful processes, right? So it's not always that sustainability is something you need to pay more for. But the first step is really to put it on the scorecard so you understand how suppliers fulfill these criteria when you're making decisions between suppliers. And then start discovering new suppliers that are more sustainable than your current ones, right? So you can potentially start switching spend to suppliers with higher sustainability criteria. Right. So that's really the actions that we're trying to drive in procurement, and you can't really get any of these done without a data and analytics foundation. So that's the enabler, but it's very important before you start the data and analytics exercise that you understand, what goals are we trying to optimize for, what activities are we ready to drive, and is the data that I'm, putting together, is that actually going to help me drive those activities? Because if it's not, it's a little bit of a useless transparency exercise.
Yeah. We get some more questions popping in on the chat function. That's fine. You can also use the Q&A function on the right of the chat function. But a question related to all this, does the heat map analysis drill down to the tier 2 and beyond suppliers?
Yeah, so the heat map analysis only needs supplier master data, right? So as soon as we know a supplier, the industry and region they're based in, then we can automatically aggregate recommendations for what are the risk factors for that supplier. So in order to be able to drill it into tier 2 and sub-tier supplier information, we simply need to start knowing who the suppliers of your suppliers are. And we're able to work a little bit flexibly with this. So some companies have already done a sub-tier mapping exercise, and you can upload that into the platform and we can start building out the network for you. But given that we have a method to engage your suppliers to improve or even to collect additional data, we can also engage them to basically understand what are the suppliers that are being used to supply your products. So you can start building out that network, and whenever we have a supplier name, we can start aggregating data, first risk level data, then actual performance data, and then corrective action data later on.
Maybe talk about data. Maybe can talk a bit more about the alignment of data and the companies.
Yeah, so we brought an example here around emissions data, because emissions data are collected for two reasons, right? It's typically being collected for you to start doing a carbon accounting exercise and understand, what are your overall footprint across your 3 different scopes. But what we are going to be talking about is how do you collect data from a procurement angle, and how can we use that data to drive action, because it's not the same data that's actually useful. So it's a good example. But before we go into a little bit, what that actually means, just a quick refresher here. And I think most people in the audience knows this already, but you typically split emissions down into 3 scopes. Scope 1 and 2 is what you are responsible for in your own company. That's typically a bit easier to calculate. Scope 3 is then, a lot of different factors. The typical one typically being your purchase goods and services, right? So that's where the procurement function comes into the play. Of course, your scope 3 emissions are going to be your supplier scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, right? But that's typically how you evaluate it, because it also helps you identify which actors can help us take action on these different emissions layers.
Yeah, and it's good to know, because it's very much more like, sustainability with commitments was mainly about scope 1 and scope 2, putting solar panels on your roof and that kind of stuff. And that's fine. We need that. But, now we are getting beyond that, and we are moving into the supply chain, the 60 to 80% of your carbon footprint in the supply chain, which is suppliers, and downstream with your commercial channels. And that's the reason why we show all this. But okay. Maybe you have also a different way how to apply your data and to align it.
Yeah, so this is why we wanted to talk about emissions, because again, your scope 3 emissions, and if you want to reduce your scope 3 emissions, you ultimately need to get your suppliers to reduce their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, or to purchase products with lower emissions data, right? Mm-hmm. And again, remember, what goals are we optimizing for? We're optimizing in procurement for being able to take action on it, right? Either collaborating with the supplier to reduce the overall emissions for that specific supplier, and thereby reduce your scope 3 emissions, or to help you select between suppliers and help allocate spend to lower emission based suppliers. So those are kind of the actions we're optimizing for in the procurement function, right? And that means that when we start looking at different ways of calculating emissions, some of them are simply not going to work in a supply chain context. So the first one that a lot of companies are doing when they do their first carbon accounting is what's called the spend-based method. What we basically, the way we calculate this is that you have a number of units that you are purchasing. Let's say the number of soybeans that you're purchasing, and then you multiply that by the average emission factors or the average emissions per unit of soybeans, for example. That's good enough to give you an 80-20 sense of what are my emissions within that category, and it's easy for the supplier because they don't actually need to provide any data on it, right? The problem is that it can't actually be used to drive actions, because remember, for you to select suppliers that are more sustainable, or to collaborate with them to become more sustainable, we can't base it on industry averages, right? Because all of your suppliers within that category are going to be based on the same emissions factor. So that one is completely out when it comes from a supply chain perspective. The second step that we then typically do, when we do a normal carbon accounting exercise, is we start looking into activities. So what are your concrete activities as a company? Not just, let's say we're buying soybeans, but, what activities went into producing those soybeans? How efficient was the factory? What, electricity is that factory running on? Is that electricity from renewable sources, et cetera, et cetera? And this means we get to a way higher level of accuracy, and that's quite useful then for selecting between suppliers and collaborating with suppliers, because we understand how the emissions data for that specific supplier looks like, and we can compare that. The problem is that now we get very, very detailed, right? So you're now basically asking your supplier for very buyer-specific data, data related to just what you're buying from them, and they need to provide you with very specific activity-based data, which is just extremely difficult to get from that supplier. So although the accuracy is quite high and it's useful for collaborating and selecting suppliers, it's very difficult to get from your supply chain. And again, we have a little bit of a problem using it in the procurement context. What is a lot more feasible to do in a procurement context is what's called the company level method. So, if we're able to understand the overall emissions for your individual suppliers, the scope 1 emissions, 2 emissions, 3 emissions, whether or not they're setting targets to reduce those and how those reductions has happened in the past, then we can use that and we can standardize that for the industry they're in, etc., to start comparing between suppliers. Because now we have an overall emissions number that can be used for comparison, that can be used for collaboration. We can see that number going down over time. And very importantly, that data is not specific to you as a customer, right? Because they can reuse that data with every single one of their customers, and they can contract, any number of vendors to help them calculate that data. So that's quite useful in the procurement context. The accuracy is not as big as the activity-based method, because the way you allocate that to your scope 3 emissions is you take a percentage of your spend of their revenues, and they might have some products that operate at higher emissions footprint, and you would be accountable for that as well. So the accuracy is not as high as an activity-based method, but it helps you drive action in your supply chain. So that one is typically quite useful. The gold standard when it comes to at least selecting supplier, but also to some extent with collaborating, and definitely from an accuracy point of view, is what's called life cycle analysis of the individual products you're buying. So basically, can you get the suppliers to conduct a life cycle analysis of the products you're buying from them? Then that's very accurate in terms of helping you estimate, what are your footprint with those products. It's a little bit easier for your suppliers than the activity-based method, because again, they need to conduct an LCA analysis on one product, and then they can reuse that across all the different buyers. So in that sense, it's a little bit more scalable, but it does require a lot of work. So a lot of your suppliers are probably not going to be there yet, but you can work towards getting to this level of data. So we got a little bit nerdy and a little bit deep there, but I think the main point that we just want to get across is think about how you're going to use this data, and make sure that the way that you are both what data you're asking for and the way that you're collecting it is actually feasible in a supply chain context, because you are meeting some different barriers than you are when you're just evaluating it internally, and not all approaches make sense.
So about the last part about the lifecycle analysis, you're stating that the usefulness for collaboration is only 50% or not 100%. So why is that?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a little bit directional to help guide you. I think one of the reasons we don't see it as effective for a collaboration angle is that when we talk about collaboration, we're talking about how can we work together with the supplier to implement initiatives to basically reduce the emissions for that supplier, and thereby the emissions in our own scope 3. And that's typically a little bit easier to do at an overall emissions level, because you can then help the supplier working towards being more efficient, using the right materials, etc. Whereas when we're talking on a very concrete product basis, it might be a little bit more difficult to start optimizing for emissions. So that's why we rank it a little bit lower. It's still useful, but it does require a little bit more context knowledge to be able to collaborate on making individual products more efficient from an emissions perspective.
I don't know if it's also in here, but a question from the audience. What about environmental product declaration, EPD?
Yeah, again, a great point, right? Your data will come in at different levels, and that's very important to understand. So sometimes when you are evaluating, the environmental performance of your supply chain, you'll be looking at a supplier level or even at a site level. Sometimes you can go all the way down to the environmental level. The product level. Again, what's important for us is we understand, in those environmental declarations, what are we exactly providing information on? Is it on waste? Is it on emissions, like again LCA data, etc.? And then we can use that as part of the broader context, together with the supplier data and the site data, to take decisions on it.
Yeah, and maybe we get to the third part of our webinar. Otherwise, we are not going to make it through the whole presentation. So, how to measure sustainability and solutions to the data problem. And maybe you can talk about more about what to collect and from who and how to deal with it.
Yeah, exactly. So So one of our central theses here is that it's very important to understand that you're now dealing with the supply chain. And when you're dealing with data across the supply chain, you have some very different mechanisms than when you're dealing with data internally in your organization. So on the left-hand side there, a lot of customers or a lot of buyers will have the tendency to send out the same request to all of their suppliers because that's easier for them to manage. It can be quite difficult to actually get the responses back. Sometimes you might force them to go through a certification process, or let's say a certain audit evaluation or similar, and that can sometimes give you a black box rating that you don't know what to do with, and that's hard for you to communicate about. It can be a very resource-heavy process because, again, if you have 2,000 suppliers in your supply chain, you need to be able to engage those at scale. And that can drive you to completely simplifying requests and ask all of these yes/no questions. But in our point of view, yes/no questions are not really data points, right? They're more an elaboration of what you used to do before, which is getting them to sign a document that they don't have any child labor. Now you're just asking them, do you have any child labor, yes or no? So for us, we need to be very careful about, how do we, what initiatives do we take to overcome the extreme workload of engaging the supplier base while not resolving to something that doesn't really add any data. What's very important is on the right-hand side, every single one of your suppliers will have a lot of different buyers, right? And they will be sitting in your shoes as well. They will be sitting, okay, we need to standardize, we need to go with one methodology. It's easiest if we get them to do the certification, or it's easiest if we send out our specific survey. But the problem is that the supplier receives these in different formats from every single buyer. So we even have suppliers that are getting audited up to 60 times per year on the same topics. And that's just an incredible amount of workload. And it's only going to get worse because the amounts of buyers that are pushing sustainability today is a fraction of who's going to be pushing it in 5 years, for example. Yes. So this scalability is a real issue, partly also because that data needs to be continuously updated. And we need to think about, how can we solve this both from the buyer perspective, so they don't need to spend a ton of resources engaging the thousands of suppliers, but also from a supplier perspective, so they can reuse the information that they share across their buyers. And again, they don't come into a problem where they just simply cannot comply with your data request because they have 50 customers asking different data requests in slightly different ways.
Yeah, and so what is your practical approach in all this?
Yeah, so our proposition is that you really need to leverage the full data landscape, right? So instead of this tendency to jump to unique disclosures, and over-reliance on surveys or specific certification, it's very important that we engage the full data landscape firsthand. And that means that we use risk information, so industry-level information, geographical information, to help you understand where you need to dive deeper and help you really segment that overall data task. And then we need to use the secondary data landscape. So everything from, whatever certificates they already have to different disclosures they've done to CDP or science-based targets, etc. We need to leverage the claims that they're giving in their sustainability reports, maybe even on their websites and their communications, and even be able to leverage previous disclosures they've given to other customers. The problem, of course, is that today that's very time-consuming and manual, and we even see some companies spending a ton of time doing desktop research on these topics. But if you're able to do it at scale, you're also able to significantly reduce the reliance on unique disclosure and unique data requests, which makes it a lot easier for your supplier to comply to, and thereby easier for you to get the information.
Yeah, but as you said, it takes a ton of work to do all this. So how do you make it work on your side?
Yeah, so just to give a little bit of an example here of that fragmentation. So when we work even with the smallest of our customers, in this example, they only have 48 unique suppliers, right? We are working across a data landscape that goes into the hundreds of unique data sources. So the fragmentation is quite big, which can be quite difficult to understand if you don't have a ton of resources. And I think we have another slide afterwards. Because the complexity really gets magnified here, because every one of these data sources looks differently. So now, you need to understand, how do I compare a supplier that, let's say, is certified by Fair for Life with another supplier that is reporting to Carbon Disclosure Project, with a third supplier that has been evaluated by EcoVadis, right? So there is quite a lot of complexity if you choose to dive into this using a manual approach.
Yeah, you see it here. Here's an example of the data inside of this kind of reports.
Yeah, exactly. So, for example, take Fair for Life on the left-hand side there. How do I actually understand what it means when my supplier has received 156 points for, respect for human rights and decent working conditions? How do I take action on this? What does that mean? How do I compare it to other suppliers that might have, done disclosure in different ways? That can be quite time-consuming to start looking into.
And on the right-hand side, you see another example. But how do you use this? And how? I presume that you are scraping these reports, these data sets, to make sense of it all, and then you add some intelligence to translate it or to apply it.
Yeah, exactly. So the way that we approach it is that, one step is getting the data in the first place, right? So we need to automate a lot of the data collection, both via scraping, but also via different API requests, etc. And being able to go through suppliers' websites and basically automate the desktop research that happens today. So one problem is, how do we get the data in the first place? But the second problem is then what we see here. What do you do when you have the data, and how do you actually transfer that to decision making? So in Responsibly specifically, we add a data layer on top of all of the different data sources where we help map it into the individual parameters. So we help you understand, for example, whether it is living wages or minimum wages that has been assessed, whether we're talking about, scope 1 emissions or, reduction goal, etc. And then we help you understand what does the individual data points actually mean. So again, is a 156 score from Fair for Life, is that a great performance score on working rights, for example? Or is a well below 2 degrees target set by STPI, is that ambitious? And how ambitious is it? And how do I compare it to the other targets that are set inside and outside of SBTI? So we try to take all of that complexity away from our customers and just present them with the individual parameters that they have chosen to evaluate based on the heat map analysis. And then, how all of the different data sources helps you evaluate whether that parameter is performing highly or negatively, so you can start taking action on it.
So there was also a question from the audience related to eco labels. So I understand that the eco labels are in these reports. They are, a statement from these sources.
Exactly. So an eco label is one of the different types of sources, right? Typically on a product level, a lot of eco labels related to, for example, being certified on a few different parameters or being organic, etc. For us, every label is a data source and a standard. And when we onboard that label, we basically map it up against the actual sustainability parameters that have been evaluated. And we dive into the methodology to understand, okay, how are they assessing, let's say living wages? And if it's binary, what does it mean when it has been labeled or certified? If it's non-binary and there are quantitative values behind it, how do we translate the quantitative values from that specific label into an actual score? So we try to work across both, binary labels, quantified labels, and help you understand whether that means the supplier is high performing or low performing on the given parameters that has been evaluated by that label.
So I also got a question about KPIs, but we're in supply chain and we work with a lot of KPIs. But in sustainability, what kind of KPIs are you using? And depending on all these sources and data, are there very specific KPIs in this matter for sustainable procurement?
Yeah, there are, and it varies a little bit across the parameters, right? So when we talk about a lot of the social parameters, we typically, talk about KPIs related to, having undergone audit processes or having been certified or, for example, for living wages, whether or not they're actually complying to living wages standards, etc. So it's typically binary, right? And we typically try to, take it from a, percentage of the suppliers where this is actually a big risk factor, down to, where have we actually, the supplier can prove that they are verified, that there's no child labor, forced labor in the supply chain. So that's for a lot of the social parameters, but then a lot of the parameters are quantitative, right? So we can directly go in and quantify gender pay gap, for example, or percentage diversity ownership in a board. Emissions are, by definition, a very quantitative parameter, so we're able to track how those improve or reduce over time. A lot of the metrics related to water stewardship, for example, and deforestation can also be quantified because it's not an either or, but it typically falls on a scale where you can improve more or less. When we talk about KPIs, we typically link it with reporting, right? So what KPIs do you need to communicate externally, either to stakeholders or to different reporting functions? And then we will make sure that we get those KPIs tracked.
Yeah, but in supply chain planning, we talk about OTIF, on time in full, and we talk about service level. I totally disagree about the use of OTIF, but that's another discussion. But we want to have clear KPIs to report to our CEO or to our shareholders or stakeholders. But that's not that clear in this matter, and maybe we don't have this clear one number KPI in this whole matter. But maybe you can explain it with a clear example, how to apply your application in reality and in a practical sense.
Yeah, so again, our perspective is that there's a few different use cases that you're optimizing for. One thing is, overall evaluation. So you can start, evaluating the sustainability criteria when you're making sourcing decisions or when you're collaborating with suppliers. Another one is, actual KPIs or goals you want to communicate externally, like, to which extent your suppliers have set targets to reduce, or how many are disclosing emissions and how those are going down or up over time. And that's back to what we talked about earlier, right? Which is that you need to start setting the goals that you're optimizing for, because that's going to help you define what you track and how you track it. But the way that we do it is that we try to automate the data process. So we start even before engaging the supplier. We start looking at risk information. We look at secondary data. We look at the claims that they're making. And that gives us a pretty good first assessment of every single supplier. Because especially when we talk about environmental sustainability, if you're taking action out of the ordinary, you're typically communicating about it. So if we cannot find any data on a specific parameter, that typically means that you're not doing anything about it and will grade you on a low score. And then after that, we use all of that information to really reduce the supply engagement effort. We start the supply engagement effort by collecting disclosures they've given to other customers in the past, or other kind of, let's say they've gone through an EcoVadis evaluation, etc. So we use that to further limit the engagement. And then finally, we can uniquely engage them on any KPIs that we couldn't pick up through an automated fashion. And we give the suppliers a way to basically reshare that information outside of Responsibly. So we try very much to work against data silos and help suppliers manage this data across all of their customers. And that means that, when we go through these 5 different steps, we reduce that scope of the engagement. We reduce how much reliance you actually have on primary data requests, but also on the ultimate burden that gets put on the suppliers, which means that we are more able to basically engage the suppliers for the missing information.
Yeah. What we see right now, and especially as a publication like a supply chain movement, we get a lot of press releases from companies making all kind of decarbonization commitment, and it sounds most of the time like a hollow shell. Yeah, we are committed to this and to that. That's fine, but doesn't say that much. So, are you also in that area to have a bit of a decarbonization commitment?
Yeah, because from our perspective, when you start decarbonizing your supply chain, if you do it in the procurement function, it's all about using your procurement power to start first getting your suppliers to disclose on emission, but second to get them to set targets and actually reduce that over time. If you talk about it from a product development angle, there's a lot of engineering that can go into it as well, right? How can we make sure we engineer our products so they have a lower footprint and we can procure lower emissions items? When it comes to procurement, we need to understand emissions in the context of collaborating with suppliers and performance managing them on it, or selecting between suppliers. So what we help our customers do there is to collect the overall emissions data, to collect the targets that they've set, to understand how different target methodologies compare with each other, and then to track how those targets are reduced over time, and how those reductions you're seeing in your supply chain affects your own scope 3 emission reductions. So that's basically how we help you work through it. So you can use this both for scenario analysis when deciding where to allocate spend to see how much would it affect your scope 3 emissions if you choose that supplier versus that one, but also to understand, where are the largest footprints in my supply chain, and where do I really need to work with the suppliers to make sure that they get these targets set and that hold them accountable that they're actually meeting the reductions. So we help you get transparency on that, and again work through the full kind of data pipeline from first, understanding through sources like CDP or SBTi, all their own sustainability disclosures, whether those targets and emissions are already being disclosed before we engage the supplier, and then we help you engage the remainder of them to make sure that they, get emissions disclosed, to make sure that they get targets set, and then follow up with them over time to see whether or not they're on track to achieving those reductions.
Maybe you can have a brief conclusion before we go to the Q&A right after this, because we have 5 minutes left. Maybe you have a brief conclusion, and then we get to the Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, for us, it all starts with, determining what do you want to get out of a sustainable procurement strategy, because it can be a little bit overwhelming, right? And it can mean many different things. There's different goals to optimize for. And you should go with the solutions, manual or digital, that can help you achieve those goals. We think it helps if you can be, into a modular system, so you don't need to, work across 4 or 5 different systems to achieve your targets. It's typically easier to work through one system across all of your different sustainable procurement goals. And then very important that you don't evaluate all of your suppliers the same way, right? That you're able to segment for your different goals which suppliers are actually going to help me achieve those targets. So that's the first step, right? Make sure that you approach this strategically, determine what do you want to get out of the procurement strategy, how does your supply chain look like? We can of course help with that as well. Then the second thing is, focus on reaching those targets and actually driving improvements while using technology to reducing the workload. So again, the supply chain is a huge scalability issue. So you don't want to be doing all of this work in a manual fashion. That's going to cost you a lot of resources. So try to identify opportunities to digitize the workflows, to automate them, and then focus on the activities that will help you achieve your goals, rather than again trying to boil the ocean or try to assess everything. So that's the number 2 advice. And then the third one is that, engage the full data landscape. So respect your suppliers, try to minimize the burden, because that's going to make it easier for you to get compliance as well. And try to work across all of the data that exists first before jumping into primary data requests. Your suppliers are your partners at the end of the day, right? So you want to make sure that you don't bombard them with topics. And if you don't have the same bargaining power as the very big enterprises do, you also can't get away with it, right? So we really recommend that you start engaging the full data landscape, because that's going to help you immensely when you look at your supply chain. All right,
quite clear. We have some minutes, 3 minutes for the Q&A. One question from the audience. Can you also say something about ISO 2400 sustainable procurement? So how is the ISO related to your approach?
Yeah, so first of all, we're not ISO certified yet, but it is something that we're looking into. Deploying systems like ours helps you, achieve certifications like that, because it helps you basically prove that you are implementing sustainable procurement processes. What's also important is that certificates like ISO 40 or 2401 can help you assess your suppliers where the risks of their supply chain is high. So you want to see whether they actually are adopting the right processes to manage, the sustainability footprint of their own supply chain. So it can both be working, as a way to certify your own actions and use that in your customer communication upstream, but it's also a relevant data source when you're looking into your supply chain to understand whether they're taking action on their own suppliers.
A question from my side. So how much time will it take to implement your solution? So when can you be live as of today, getting into the future?
Yeah, so it depends a little bit on how big the supply chain is and how complex it is. It's quite simple. You need to upload your supplier master data. Then we'll start aggregating data on it. That happens fairly automatically, but we do need to sanity check a few different things before we take it live to you. So that typically takes a few weeks. And then we're ready to go. So we can do it quite quickly, but it does depend on how deep you want to go, how much strategy work needs to be done around setting the targets versus to which extent can you use presets to just get going straight away. And then it depends on, how big your supply chain is and how much time does it actually take to aggregate that information. And then other than that, sustainable procurement is a continuous task, right? So you will be engaging your suppliers over time. You will be tracking improvements and new risks popping up over time. So it is something that you're going to be engaged on continually, but hopefully at a very low workforce, because we try to automate a lot of the workflows going into it.
All right, Thomas. I'm looking at the watch at the clock. It's 5 o'clock CET. So I would recommend that people who want to discuss more with Thomas and me, please join our after talk in the lounge right after this. So on the left you see the maturity matrix and a link to download it with all the startups and way more. So that's where you can download information about the supply chain startups in a broader sense. And to the right, you see the website of Responsibly. So that's and the contact data of Thomas. With this, thank you, Thomas, for explaining all this very interesting stuff. I would say. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Martin. It was a pleasure. And look, if anybody wants to engage further on the topic, whether or not it's with our solution, then we're always happy to hear feedback and understand what problems you're sitting with specifically, because it is very much a topic that's evolving, right? So we need to make sure we evolve with it and we keep understanding how we can basically make it as scalable as possible to procure sustainably.
So thanks again, and the audience, thank you for listening in, and thank you for the great questions. And if you have more questions, please join us in the lounge right after this. We will be sitting at table 1, and if not, I hope to see you again in the next webinar and Webinar Wednesday. Thank you for now, and bye-bye.
Thank you.